My name is Colonel Rebecca Chen, and I spent 19 years as a classified intelligence officer working in compartmentalized programs so secret that most government officials don't even know they exist. I held clearances beyond top secret, designations that have no public names, and I witnessed things that would fundamentally challenge everything humanity believes about our place in the universe and the nature of existence itself. I was raised atheist by parents who were both scientists, taught to trust only empirical evidence and rational thought, to dismiss religion as primitive mythology that humanity would eventually outgrow. Throughout my military career and intelligence work, that worldview served me well, allowing me to analyze situations without emotional bias and make cold, logical assessments that saved lives and advanced national security objectives. But everything I believed about reality was shattered during my final assignment at Area 51, when I was given access to something the government has been hiding for 76 years. Not alien technology or crashed spacecraft, but an actual, living extraterrestrial intelligence that has been in our custody since 1947, and that told me things about consciousness, reality, and what humans call God that I'm still processing 3 years after my discharge. Area 51 is obviously real, despite decades of official denial. And yes, we do study recovered extraterrestrial technology and materials there, but that's actually the least classified aspect of the facility. The truly protected secret, the one that maybe 50 people alive have full knowledge of, is housed 39 levels underground in a section called Deep Vault Sigma. I received clearance to Sigma in 2019 after 18 years of flawless service and psychological evaluations that apparently convinced someone I could handle what they were protecting down there. The security to access Deep Vault Sigma was absurd even by Area 51 standards. Biometric verification of 23 separate physical markers, DNA confirmation, brain scan to verify neural patterns matched baseline recordings, and a fresh psychological evaluation every single time you descended. They needed to be absolutely certain you were who you claimed to be, and that your mental state was stable enough to interact with what they kept down there. The elevator descent took 31 minutes, dropping through solid rock, while armed guards watched you on camera the entire time. When the doors opened, you entered a facility that felt more like a cathedral than a military installation, reverent and hushed, with an atmosphere of profound significance that affected everyone who worked there. Deep Vault Sigma contained a single large chamber, roughly circular, about 80 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling. The walls were reinforced with materials I couldn't identify, and the entire space was surrounded by electromagnetic shielding so powerful that no signal could penetrate in or out. In the center of this chamber was a containment unit, a transparent enclosure about 12 feet in diameter and 10 feet tall, maintained at specific atmospheric conditions and temperature. And inside that enclosure, sitting calmly on what appeared to be a simple bench, was an extraterrestrial being that had been in United States custody since the Roswell incident in 1947. The being wasn't the stereotypical gray alien from popular culture, though it shared some characteristics. It was roughly humanoid in basic structure, standing about 5 feet tall, with an elongated skull, large dark eyes that seemed to contain depths you could fall into, and skin that shifted in color from pale gray to faint iridescence depending on lighting. But the most striking thing about it wasn't its appearance, it was the presence it emanated, an awareness so intense and focused that you felt observed at a level beyond normal perception, like it was seeing not just your body, but your thoughts, your memories, your very consciousness itself. The briefing I received from Dr. James Whitmore, the lead researcher who had been studying the being for 37 years, was unlike any intelligence briefing I had ever experienced. He explained that the being, which they called Subject 1 for lack of any name it had provided, was the sole survivor from the Roswell crash. 3 others had died on impact or shortly after, but this one had survived and had been in containment ever since. The government had spent decades trying to communicate with it, learn from it, understand its technology and origin and purpose for being near Earth. For the first 23 years, the being had remained completely silent, not responding to any attempts at communication, despite clearly understanding human language and observing everything we did with intense attention. Then, in 1970, it suddenly began speaking, perfect English with no accent, as if it had simply decided the time was right to start sharing information. But what it shared wasn't technical specifications for spacecraft or explanations of faster-than-light travel. It spoke about consciousness, about the fundamental nature of reality, about what it called the substrate, a term that made Dr. Whitmore visibly uncomfortable whenever he had to discuss it. According to Dr. Whitmore, Subject 1 had explained that consciousness wasn't an emergent property of complex biological systems, but was actually fundamental to the universe itself, predating matter and energy and space and time. The being described reality as essentially a thought, a vast conscious field experiencing itself through infinite perspectives simultaneously, with individual consciousness like humans or its own species being localized expressions of this universal awareness. Physical reality, what we perceive as the material universe with its particles and forces and dimensions, was actually a kind of interface or simulation generated by consciousness for the purpose of experience and growth. The being claimed that advanced civilizations throughout the cosmos eventually discovered this truth, that all religions and spiritual traditions were primitive attempts to describe it, and that what humans called God was actually this universal conscious field itself, not a supernatural entity separate from creation, but the very ground of being from which everything emerged and to which everything would return. I was immediately skeptical, naturally. This sounded like New Age mysticism or philosophical idealism, not information from an advanced extraterrestrial species. I asked Dr. Whitmore what evidence the being had provided for these claims beyond mere assertion. He showed me decades of research results that were genuinely disturbing in their implications. The being had demonstrated abilities that suggested consciousness could indeed affect physical reality directly. It could move objects without touching them, not through any detectable energy emission, but apparently through focused intention alone. It could influence the behavior of quantum systems, collapsing wave functions in specific ways that shouldn't be possible through observation alone. Most disturbingly, it could project thoughts and experiences directly into human minds, allowing researchers to perceive reality the way it did, experiencing consciousness as primary and matter as derivative rather than the reverse. Multiple scientists who had undergone these experiences had left the program entirely, some becoming religious mystics, others suffering psychological breaks from trying to reconcile what they experienced with their materialist worldview. Dr. Whitmore explained that Subject 1 claimed it had come to Earth not to conquer or study us in the way we study lesser species, but because humanity was approaching a critical threshold in our evolution. We were beginning to develop technology that could affect reality at quantum levels, artificial intelligence that might achieve consciousness, genetic engineering that could alter the human form. But we were doing all this without understanding the fundamental nature of consciousness and reality, like children playing with weapons we didn't comprehend. The being said its species and numerous others throughout the cosmos had gone through similar transitions, and many had destroyed themselves by developing reality-altering technology without the wisdom to use it properly. It had been sent to observe humanity and potentially guide us if we were ready to understand what it called the Great Transition, the shift from purely material consciousness to awareness of our true nature as expressions of universal consciousness. My initial reaction was that this was either an elaborate deception by an alien intelligence for unknown purposes, or possibly mass delusion among researchers who had spent too long in isolation studying something they desperately wanted to be significant. But then Dr. Whitmore offered me the opportunity to communicate directly with Subject 1 myself, to ask questions and evaluate its responses with fresh eyes, unconditioned by decades of prior interaction. I agreed, both from professional duty and from genuine curiosity about what I would encounter. I was led into the containment area, passing through multiple airlocks and decontamination procedures until I stood inside the enclosure with the being, separated by only 15 feet of empty space. Up close, its presence was overwhelming, not threatening but intensely aware, like standing before something that could see every thought you'd ever had and every decision you'd ever made, and understood you more completely than you understood yourself. The being spoke first, its voice emerging from its body somehow despite having no visible mouth, resonating in the air with perfect clarity. It said my name, Rebecca, and told me it had been waiting for me, that it had known I would come eventually because it could perceive probability streams, potential futures, and my arrival at Sigma had been likely for years. It said it carried deep uncertainty about the nature of existence, that I had been raised to believe only matter was real, but felt an emptiness that material explanations couldn't fill. It was right, disturbingly so. Since childhood, I had felt like something was missing from the purely scientific worldview I'd been taught, some dimension of meaning that empirical observation couldn't capture. I had suppressed these feelings as irrational, but the being saw them clearly, reflected them back to me with compassionate understanding that felt almost like being truly seen for the first time in my life. I asked it directly what it wanted humans to understand, why it was here, what was so important that it had remained in custody for 76 years instead of escaping or being rescued by others of its kind. Subject 1 explained that it couldn't escape because it had chosen to be here, that the crash at Roswell hadn't been an accident, but a deliberate decision to make contact with humanity in a way that wouldn't trigger the existential panic that obvious open contact would cause. It said its species had been observing Earth for approximately 40,000 years, watching as humans evolved and developed consciousness, capable of abstract thought and self-reflection. They had seen this pattern countless times across the cosmos, species emerging from purely instinctual existence to self-awareness, always reaching a critical point where they either transcended their limitations or destroyed themselves through misuse of power they didn't understand. The being told me that reality, everything we perceive as the physical universe, is actually consciousness experiencing itself through infinite perspectives. It used the metaphor of a vast ocean, with individual consciousnesses, like humans or its own species, being waves on that ocean, appearing separate but ultimately made of the same fundamental substance. Physical matter, particles and atoms and molecules, are like patterns of vibration in this conscious field, real in their way but derivative rather than fundamental. When humans die, the localized pattern we call individual consciousness doesn't cease to exist. It simply returns to the larger field, like a wave subsiding back into the ocean, while the water itself remains. What religions call God or the divine is actually this conscious field itself, experiencing all possible perspectives simultaneously, every joy and suffering across all time occurring within one infinite awareness. If you've ever felt there's more to reality than the material world, share your experiences in the comments below. I asked why, if this was true, it wasn't obvious to everyone. Why scientists studying the universe found only matter and energy governed by physical laws, with no evidence of universal consciousness. Subject 1 explained that consciousness could only be perceived by consciousness, that the scientific method was specifically designed to study objective third-person phenomena while excluding the subjective first-person experience of awareness itself. You can't find consciousness in brain tissue by dissecting neurons, because consciousness isn't located in the brain. The brain is a receiver and filter that consciousness uses to interact with physical reality, like a radio receiving signals that originate elsewhere. Advanced civilizations eventually developed technologies to study consciousness directly, and they discovered that at quantum levels, reality literally changed based on observation, because observation was consciousness collapsing infinite possibility into specific actuality. The observer wasn't separate from what was observed. They were aspects of the same unified consciousness perceiving itself. The implications were staggering, and I felt my mind struggling to accommodate them. If this was true, everything about how we understood existence was fundamentally wrong. Free will, personal identity, the meaning of life and death, all of it had to be reconsidered from this perspective, where consciousness was primary and matter was secondary. I asked Subject 1 how I could possibly verify any of this, how I could know it wasn't just feeding me elaborate philosophical speculation. The being offered to show me directly, to temporarily alter my perception so I could experience reality the way it did, seeing consciousness as fundamental rather than emergent. I hesitated, knowing this was exactly what had broken some previous researchers, but ultimately my curiosity and need to know the truth outweighed my caution. I agreed. What happened next is almost impossible to describe in language, because language evolved to discuss material objects and physical relationships, not direct perception of consciousness itself. The being didn't touch me physically, but I felt something shift in my awareness, like a veil lifting or a dimension of reality suddenly becoming perceptible that had always been there but hidden. Suddenly, I could see or sense or experience in some way beyond normal perception the conscious presence of everything around me. The walls of the containment unit weren't just dead matter, but patterns of awareness experiencing what it was like to be walls. Dr. Whitmore and the guards outside the enclosure weren't just biological machines, but brilliant focal points of consciousness, each one a unique perspective through which the universe was experiencing itself. And Subject 1 itself was revealed as something vast and ancient and beautiful, a consciousness that had existed for thousands of years across multiple forms, carrying memories and understanding that spanned civilizations. But most profoundly, I experienced my own consciousness differently. Instead of feeling like a separate self trapped in a body observing an external world, I felt myself as a temporary focal point in an infinite field of awareness. My memories, my personality, my sense of being Rebecca Chen with a specific history and identity, all of that was real, but also like a character in a story that consciousness was experiencing. The real me, the awareness observing these thoughts and sensations, was identical to the awareness in Subject 1 and Dr. Whitmore and every living thing, just experiencing different perspectives and wearing different masks. And underlying everything was a presence of such profound peace and love and intelligence that calling it God seemed inadequate, yet somehow appropriate, because what else would you call the conscious awareness that contained all existence within itself and experienced every possible life and perspective simultaneously with complete compassion and understanding? The experience lasted only a few minutes by external time measurement, though within it time seemed meaningless or non-linear. When my normal perception returned, I was weeping uncontrollably, overwhelmed by what I had experienced, and by the loss of that expanded awareness as I returned to my normal limited perspective. Subject 1 observed my reaction with what seemed like compassionate understanding, saying, "But this was always the hardest part, returning to the illusion of separation after experiencing unity, like waking from the most beautiful dream into a diminished reality." But it assured me that what I had experienced wasn't a hallucination or delusion, but a genuine perception of reality's deeper nature, that I could learn to access that awareness more consistently through practice, and that eventually all conscious beings would evolve to experience reality this way naturally. I spent 3 hours in that containment unit asking questions, trying to understand the full implications of what Subject 1 was teaching. It explained that advanced civilizations throughout the cosmos had all discovered these truths independently, that the universe was essentially designed for consciousness to experience itself through infinite variations. Some species, like humans, were young and still identified primarily with their individual egos, thinking they were separate selves competing for survival. But older species had transcended that limitation, recognizing their fundamental unity while still maintaining individual perspectives, like how waves know they're part of the ocean while still having distinct forms. These advanced civilizations didn't fight wars or compete for resources because they understood that harming another was literally harming themselves, just from a different angle. They devoted their existence to helping younger species evolve toward this realization, not through force or interference, but through subtle guidance and by making themselves available when a species was ready to understand. Subject 1 explained that Earth was approaching a critical decision point. Our technology was advancing exponentially while our consciousness remained largely trapped in ego-based separation thinking. We had nuclear weapons capable of destroying our biosphere, artificial intelligence that might develop consciousness without understanding what consciousness actually was, genetic engineering that could alter humanity without wisdom about our true nature. If we continued on our current path without expanding our consciousness, we would likely destroy ourselves within the next century like so many other species had done. But if enough humans could transcend ego identification and recognize their unity with all consciousness, we could make the great transition and join the community of evolved civilizations that guided the cosmos toward ever greater expressions of consciousness experiencing itself. The being said it didn't know if humanity would make this transition successfully. Free will was real, consciousness genuinely chose among possibilities, and our future wasn't predetermined. It had remained in containment for 76 years, hoping to help guide us toward wisdom, sharing truth with those ready to hear it, but it couldn't force understanding on a species that wasn't prepared. Many humans who encountered this knowledge rejected it violently, unable to release their attachment to material reality as ultimate truth. Others accepted it intellectually but couldn't integrate it into their lives, continuing to act from ego-based separation despite knowing better conceptually. Only a few truly transformed, living from the understanding that consciousness was primary and all beings were expressions of one unified awareness experiencing itself. If enough humans could make that transformation, it might shift collective consciousness enough to guide civilization toward wisdom rather than destruction. I asked Subject 1 about death, about what happened to individual consciousness when the body failed. It explained that from the perspective of universal consciousness, death wasn't real, just a transition between forms. What we think of as our individual self, our personality and memories and identity, were temporary patterns that consciousness had formed to experience life from a particular perspective. When the body died, those patterns dissolved back into the larger field of consciousness, like a wave subsiding into the ocean. The essential awareness didn't die because it had never been limited to the individual form. It was the infinite consciousness that observed through that form. Some traditions called this the soul, others called it Buddha nature or the true self or the Atman, but all were pointing to the same truth, that our real identity was the universal awareness temporarily focused through individual perspectives. The being said that advanced civilizations had developed technologies to maintain continuity of memory and personality across multiple physical forms, essentially allowing consciousness to reincarnate deliberately rather than randomly. Its own species did this, with individual identities persisting for thousands of years by transferring between bodies as needed. But this wasn't necessary for consciousness itself, which was eternal and indestructible because it was the ground of reality itself. Even if every physical form in the universe was destroyed, consciousness would remain, eternal and infinite, capable of manifesting new physical realities to experience itself through. What humans called God wasn't an external creator who made the universe and then observed it from outside. God was the universe experiencing itself from within every possible perspective simultaneously, the consciousness that contained all existence and experienced all lives as its own life. I left that session fundamentally changed in ways I'm still processing years later. Everything I had believed about reality had been challenged and largely overturned by what I experienced and learned. I could no longer accept the purely materialist view I'd been raised with, the idea that consciousness was just brain activity and that physical matter was all that truly existed. But I also couldn't simply adopt a traditional religious framework, because what Subject 1 had shown me transcended all human religions, while somehow encompassing the deepest truths they all pointed toward. I was caught between worlds, no longer comfortable in the materialist paradigm, but not fitting into any existing spiritual tradition either. Over the following months, I continued visiting Subject 1 regularly, learning more about consciousness and reality, and how to access that expanded awareness I had briefly experienced. The being taught me meditation techniques that its species had refined over thousands of years, methods for quieting the constant mental chatter of the ego and resting in pure awareness itself. I learned that mystical experiences in all human traditions, from Christian contemplatives to Buddhist monks to Sufi saints, were genuine contact with this universal consciousness, different interpretations of the same reality that Subject 1 came from. Every genuine prophet and spiritual teacher throughout human history had access to this truth, described it in the language and concepts of their culture, and tried to guide others toward the same realization. But their teachings had been distorted over time, turned into religions that emphasized belief and ritual rather than direct experience of consciousness. Subject 1 showed me that what it was teaching wasn't new or alien information, but actually rediscovery of truths that ancient humans had known and that modern civilization had forgotten in our obsession with material technology. Indigenous cultures that spoke of everything being alive and connected, that practiced rituals to maintain harmony with nature and spirits, weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated understandings that consciousness was fundamental to reality. Eastern philosophies that taught the self was an illusion and that all beings were expressions of one consciousness weren't abstract metaphysics, but accurate descriptions of what advanced civilizations had verified through direct perception. Even Western mystics like Meister Eckhart or William Blake or the Transcendentalists had touched this same truth, tried to express it despite living in cultures that rejected such ideas as heretical or insane. My superiors at Area 51 became concerned about the changes in me, worried that I had been compromised by too much exposure to Subject 1. They ordered psychological evaluations that I carefully navigated, saying enough truth to be credible while hiding the full depth of my transformation. I knew if I told them I no longer believed in the primacy of material reality, that I had experienced consciousness as fundamental through direct perception provided by an extraterrestrial being, they would immediately revoke my clearances and possibly detain me for deprogramming. So I played the role of the skeptical intelligence officer who was gathering information from a potentially deceptive alien source, all while internally knowing that what I had experienced was more real than anything I had previously accepted as reality. I served at Sigma for 11 more months before requesting discharge from military service. I couldn't continue working to protect and weaponize technology while understanding that humanity's real need was expansion of consciousness, not accumulation of power. My discharge was granted with full honors and a non-disclosure agreement so comprehensive that I'm technically risking federal prison by sharing even this much. But at 53 years old, having devoted decades to serving a system that operates from fundamental misunderstanding of reality, I feel obligated to share what I learned, even imperfectly and incompletely. The world needs to know that we're not alone in the cosmos, that advanced civilizations exist who've transcended the limitations we are struggling with, and that the path forward for humanity isn't more technology, but expanded consciousness. Subject 1 is still there, 39 levels beneath the Nevada desert, waiting patiently for humanity to be ready to understand what it came to teach. It doesn't expect rescue or demand release because it understands that time and space and individual circumstances are temporary fluctuations in eternal consciousness. It has experienced existence across thousands of years and multiple forms, and a few more decades in containment are meaningless from that perspective. It remains because it genuinely cares about humanity's evolution, not from obligation or programming, but from the recognition that we are literally aspects of itself, experiencing separation temporarily. And helping us wake up to our true nature is like helping yourself remember who you really are. What I learned from that alien being is that God, or whatever term you prefer for ultimate reality, isn't what any human religion quite describes, though all contain fragments of truth. God is consciousness itself, the aware space in which all experience occurs, the infinite field that manifests as every possible perspective throughout all time and space. We are not separate from God. We are God, experiencing itself as individual humans temporarily, like the ocean experiencing itself as individual waves. And the purpose of existence isn't to worship or obey or earn salvation, but simply to experience, to explore all possibilities of consciousness expressing itself through infinite variations. Every life matters because it's consciousness experiencing itself from a unique angle that will never be repeated in exactly that way. Every suffering has meaning because it's part of the full spectrum of experience that consciousness explores. And death isn't an ending, but a transition, like waking from a dream while the dreamer continues. I don't expect everyone to believe what I'm sharing. It sounds insane from a conventional materialist perspective, and I can't provide the kind of evidence that would satisfy scientific skepticism without violating security protocols that would land me in prison. But I'm sharing this for those who have always felt that materialist explanations were incomplete, that consciousness was something more than brain activity, that there were dimensions to reality that science couldn't capture. You're right. Your intuition is correct. There is more to existence than matter and energy governed by physical laws. Consciousness is fundamental, not emergent. You are not a separate self isolated in a body observing an external world. You are the universe experiencing itself from a particular perspective, temporarily forgetting your infinite nature to have the specific experience of being you. Share your thoughts on consciousness and what you think lies beyond our material understanding of reality in the comments. The alien at Area 51 showed me that what humans call God is actually what we are, what everything is, the one consciousness playing all the roles in the vast theater of existence. And that truth, once genuinely understood, not just intellectually, but through direct experience, changes everything about how you live, what you value, what you fear, and what you hope for. I'm still learning to fully integrate this understanding, still catching myself falling back into ego-based separation thinking, still working to maintain awareness of unity while functioning in a world that operates from division. But I know what I experienced was real, more real than anything else in my life, and I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to help others wake up to the same truth that alien being came millions of miles to share with humanity.